The desert morning had just begun to warm up when the engine of the Army's most advanced tank failed in the middle of a live demonstration. Soldiers, engineers, and top brass stood frozen, eyes fixed on the steaming metal giant that had come to a sputtering halt in front of an eager crowd. 3 highly qualified engineers took turns examining the tank, tapping at screens, adjusting panels, running diagnostic tools, and muttering to each other in hushed, frustrated tones. Nothing worked. For all the millions spent and the intelligence gathered behind the tank's creation, it now sat motionless like a museum piece that had aged decades in a matter of minutes. Then someone, almost jokingly, mentioned a name, a forgotten one, a name not in any current directory or personnel file, but one passed around in old stories and cautionary tales. Charles Renert, Chuck, as most had called him back in the day. That day, surrounded by tightened bolts and skeptical stares, Chuck didn't just fix a machine. He revived something that had been gathering dust for years. His legacy. Chuck never saw himself as remarkable. He was a mechanic, not by formal training or academic pedigree, but by something deeper, an instinct, a calling. He never graduated from college. In fact, he never really had the chance. Orphaned at a young age and bounced from one foster home to the next, Chuck learned early that things in life break often. Things like homes, people, trust. And if you want them to work again, you better learn how to fix them yourself. As a kid, while others played outside or scrolled through games in later years, he'd sneak into the maintenance closets or utility rooms, looking for old motors or discarded appliances to take apart. Not to destroy them, but to understand them, to know how they ticked, and more importantly, how they failed. By the age of 12, he'd single-handedly repaired the rusted hydraulics in the orphanage's laundry room, earning a rare moment of praise from the usually distant staff. By 17, he had enlisted in the Army. It wasn't patriotism that drove him there. It was the search for a place, a sense of structure, a purpose. The Army offered him exactly that, and a uniform that finally seemed to fit. Chuck wasn't the loud type. He never led chants or cracked jokes in the mess hall. He was quiet, almost unnervingly so. But on every base he served, when a vehicle broke down or a generator gave out in the middle of a desert night, he was the first one they called. He wouldn't ask too many questions. He'd show up, crack open his beat-up toolbox, listen to the machine's groan or the hiss of its failure, and get to work. Other soldiers worked from manuals and protocol sheets, but Chuck felt the machine. It was as if he could hear it breathe, hear it whisper its secrets when everyone else only heard noise. His work never made headlines, and his name was rarely celebrated. But the vehicles ran, the missions continued, and the base always had power when it mattered. That was enough for him. Everything changed in 1982. During an experimental engine test, a hybrid propulsion system that was ahead of its time. A mechanical explosion sent metal shrapnel tearing into Chuck's right leg. It wasn't just his body that broke that day, it was everything: his career, his stability, his future. The Army issued him a pension, but the invisible scars ran deeper than the financial strain. They blamed him, quietly, unofficially, but clearly enough. The man who had once been the invisible savior of broken systems became a cautionary tale in engineering circles. His reputation was rewritten with shadows. The surgeries that followed drained his savings. The house he once bought for the wife, who left him 2 years after the injury, was sold to cover mounting bills. They'd never had children. He lived alone, carrying pain not just in his leg, but in his identity, displaced, unrecognized, and unfinished. Now, in his late 60s, Chuck worked where he could, fixing tractors on farms, repairing bulldozers and forklifts on dusty construction sites around Tucson, Arizona. He drove an old pickup that groaned louder than the engines he repaired and carried a rusted toolbox that had seen more action than most war gear. He didn't have a shop. He didn't need one. He made repairs under the sun, in the mud, inside barns, or against the backdrop of open fields. Locals knew him by sight, the old man with a limp in his right leg and a thermos of black coffee always in hand. He didn't speak much, just asked what's broken, and got to work. Younger workers often joked about him. Some were uncomfortable around him, unsure of how to engage, but the older folks, farmers, veterans, foremen, they understood. Chuck wasn't there to make friends. He was there because something was broken. And when something breaks, you don't need conversation. You need someone like Chuck. He lived in a converted storage shed behind an abandoned repair shop just off a forgotten highway. It was cramped, sure, but it was all he needed. A workbench, a cot, a hot plate, and a shelf stacked with geared manuals from eras past. No internet, no digital displays. But if a machine coughed out a sound it wasn't supposed to, Chuck could tell you exactly what it meant just by listening. His phone rarely rang. When it did, it was usually someone who'd been told, try the old guy out by the junction. But on that particular Monday morning, the ring was different. Chuck was elbow deep in the hydraulic system of a John Deere 5E tractor when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He wiped his hands on his jeans before answering. "Mr. Reiner, this is General Kurtz from Fort Wuka. We need your help, it's urgent." Chuck almost laughed. He hadn't been called Mr. with that much respect in years. "I think you've got the wrong guy, General," he said, half joking, negative. "You're Charles Reiner, former sergeant in the Army Corps of Engineers." There was a long pause. Chuck stared at the tractor, then out at the distant horizon. He thought about hanging up, but there was something in the general's voice, a weight, a tone he hadn't heard in decades, the sound of a real problem. An hour later, Chuck was driving toward Fort Wuka. The desert dust veiled the windshield, and the towering silhouette of the military complex rose like an old ghost on the horizon. His heart thudded against his ribs, caught between anxiety and a strange, unwelcome nostalgia. He hadn't been on a base in 26 years. He parked near the gate and stepped out, toolbox in hand. The soldier on duty looked barely old enough to shave. His eyes flicked across Chuck's worn boots, tattered jeans, and the sun, bleached shirt with a button missing at the collar. "Name?" the soldier asked. "Charles Reiner. I was called in by General Kurtz." The young man scanned a clipboard, then frowned. "No Charles Reiner authorized for today." Chuck stayed calm, mind confirming with the general while I wait. The soldier hesitated, clearly unsure, then picked up the phone. After a brief exchange filled with "yes, sir," and "understood, sir," he hung up and stood a little straighter. "Sergeant Williams will escort you." 2 minutes later, a younger man in uniform arrived with brisk footsteps and a courteous nod. "Mr. Reiner, I'm Sergeant Williams. The general asked me to take you to Hangar 7. They walked in silence. Chuck noticed the sideways glances from younger personnel. The way their voices hushed as he passed. Williams kept a fast pace, and Chuck had to push through the stiffness in his right leg to keep up. "You work for a defense contractor?" Williams asked, clearly curious. "I do maintenance work," Chuck replied. Williams nodded, but Chuck could see the doubt behind his eyes. They reached Hangar 7, a massive structure that echoed every footstep. Inside, partly hidden under tarps, stood one of the military's newest hybrid tanks, a marvel of engineering. Sleek, intimidating, and currently very broken. 3 engineers circled the open engine compartment like vultures that had been circling too long. One, a bald man with sharp features and frustration written across his face, looked up as they approached. "Sergeant, this the specialist. This is Charles Reiner," Williams said. The bald man raised an eyebrow and extended a hand. "Dr. Carson, lead engineer. Honestly, we were expecting someone a little more current." A younger engineer with glasses added, with more up-to-date credentials. Chuck didn't respond. He simply shook Carson's hand and turned his eyes to the engine, absorbing the structure, the layout, the unfamiliar yet oddly familiar configurations. He saw innovation, but also complication. Beauty, but also blind ambition. What seems to be the problem? He asked. Carson crossed his arms. Stealth hybrid engine, reduces heat and noise signatures, but loses power after 15 minutes of operation. We've checked everything: electronics, sensors, fuel systems, cooling. Nothing's worked. Chuck stepped closer. Mind if I take a look? Carson gestured dismissively. Sure, but we've had 5 specialists here this week. Days of diagnostics. It's not a simple issue. Chuck didn't reply. He opened his toolbox, removed a mechanical stethoscope and a flashlight, and began examining the engine the only way he knew how, by listening, not just with ears, but with instinct. While the engineers whispered behind him and exchanged skeptical smirks, Chuck moved slowly, methodically, hands tracing wires, fingers resting on metal, ears tuned to every vibration. Chuck didn't care for the commentary behind him. Whispers like, "Is that a stethoscope?" Or "You'd think he was tuning a tractor," buzzed in the background, but he had long since trained himself to ignore noise that wasn't mechanical. The way his hands moved across the exposed compartments wasn't rushed. He wasn't chasing time like the others were. He was chasing understanding. He'd always believed machines had voices. They spoke differently, sure, through hums, ticks, resistance, and the sudden hiccup of rhythm. But they spoke, and today, this machine was screaming in a language no one else had learned to hear. 20 minutes passed before he stopped. Chuck stood still, facing a part of the system the engineers hadn't given more than a passing glance. The silence caught the attention of Carson, who crossed his arms again, this time more tightly. "Did you find something?" he asked. Chuck didn't answer right away. He closed his toolbox slowly, then turned to face the trio of engineers. "The problem isn't in the engine." That statement sucked the air out of the room. The younger man with glasses frowned immediately. "What do you mean?" "That's the primary concern." Chuck pointed with 2 fingers. "It's in the system integration. There's a micro vibration in the mounting base. It only appears once the engine heats up and starts expanding. That expansion introduces harmonic dissonance. Subtle, sure, but enough to throw off synchronization between the combustion unit and the electric drive. That's your failure." The room was still. The 3 engineers exchanged glances that were part confusion, part disbelief. Carson blinked and stepped forward slightly, trying to maintain his composure. "Mr. Rainier," he said slowly, "with all due respect, that doesn't sound plausible. We've tested all the mounting bases." Chuck's tone didn't change. "Did you test them at room temperature?" The engineers didn't respond immediately. The younger one opened a clipboard, double-checking. Carson's jaw clenched. "No, but the specs were made for conventional engines." Chuck interrupted. "This isn't conventional. Hybrid systems generate different vibration signatures. You'll miss it if you're relying on static or cold diagnostics. You need to test after full heat exposure, 15 minutes minimum at high load." "You're guessing," said the young engineer, clearly agitated. Chuck didn't argue. He didn't try to convince anyone. He just closed his toolbox and turned around. "Where are you going?" Williams called after him. Chuck kept walking. "You don't need me. You already know more than I do." He walked with a limp, slow and steady, out of the hangar. The sound of his boots on concrete echoed behind him. He didn't feel anger, just a tiredness that came from knowing exactly how this would play out. It always played out this way. He was always the last call. The silent option, the relic. He sat in his truck for a while, the keys in his lap, staring at the gate in the distance. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was back in a place that once called him liability, now being dismissed again, just in subtler language. He didn't mind. He hadn't expected applause or warm welcomes. He came because something was broken. That was all. That evening, Chuck was at home, washing the remnants of a simple dinner from a metal plate, when the phone rang again. He looked at it without urgency, wiping his hands on a rag before answering. "This is Rainier. Mr. Rainier, this is Dr. Carson." Chuck paused. The voice was different now, not defensive, not prideful, human. "You were right. We retested the mounting base after full thermal exposure. The micro vibration showed up, exactly as you said. The dampers aren't rated for hybrid, level harmonics." Chuck didn't say anything. He didn't gloat, just listened. "I owe you an apology," Carson continued. I'm judged you. General Kurtz would like to speak with you in person. He asked if you'd be willing to come back." Chuck nodded once, even though the man on the line couldn't see him. "I'll be there." The next morning, Chuck returned to Hangar 7. He noticed the difference before he even entered. The guards didn't question him. The salutes were subtle, but they were there. Inside, the engineers weren't crowded around the tank like before. They were waiting. Carson approached with someone new, a man in full military dress, silver streaks at his temples, the unmistakable gravity of command in his posture. "General Kurtz, Mr. Rainier," the general said, offering a hand. "I owe you an apology for the way you were received yesterday." "No need, General." "Yes, there is," Kurtz insisted. "Dr. Carson explained the failure, and he told me something else. The mounting dampers you identified, they were based on your designs from over 4 decades ago." Chuck didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He hadn't heard that in a long time. The work he'd once done, the innovations that had quietly reshaped vehicle reliability, were so far removed from him now. He had stopped thinking of them as part of his legacy. And yet, here they were, still in use, still failing without him. The room went quiet. Engineers and soldiers alike watched as General Kurtz took a step closer. "Sergeant Rainier," he said, deliberately using the old rank, "may I ask why one of the original architects of our military hybrid propulsion systems is currently working outside our defense program? Fixing tractors, I'm told." Chuck let the silence hang before answering. "There was an accident in '82 during testing. I was blamed, injured. They saw me as a risk after that." "I understand," the general said softly. Carson shifted beside them, visibly uneasy. "Mr. Rainier, I sincerely apologize for my assumptions. I was wrong." Chuck gave him a small nod. "It's all right, Doctor. No harm done." Kurtz took a breath. "Sergeant, may I make a proposal? We have other systems, other problems. We could use someone like you." Chuck didn't smile, but something softened in his posture. "I appreciate the offer, truly, but that chapter's closed. I'm not that man anymore." The general didn't press. "Then allow me to offer this," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "This is for your service, and for the recognition you should have received years ago." Chuck didn't reach for it right away. He looked at the envelope, then at the general. "I didn't do it for that." "I know," Kurtz replied. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Chuck took the envelope and tucked it into his jacket without opening it. He turned and glanced one last time at the tank, the one that now hummed quietly, without vibration, without failure. The problem was gone. The system had been restored, but something else had been restored too, his place in the narrative. The following morning, Chuck was under the same John Deere 5E tractor, adjusting the hydraulic cylinder he'd been working on before all this started. His tools clinked softly against the metal as he worked. The rhythm of normal life. Tires crunched on the gravel outside. He turned slightly, expecting a farmer or local contractor. But it was Dr. Carson, stepping out of a polished black SUV in a dress shirt. No lab coat this time. "Sergeant," Carson called out as he approached. "I had to come see you again." Chuck stood, wiping his hands slowly. "Something wrong with the tank?" "No, it's running better than ever," Carson said. He leaned against the SUV bumper, eyes squinting in the sun. "I just wanted to say something in person. Chuck waited. When you identified that micro vibration, I felt small," Carson said. "Not because you embarrassed us, but because I realized how blind I'd been. I've spent my whole life surrounded by brilliant people, degrees, credentials, labs filled with innovation, but none of them heard what you heard in that hangar. You understood something we couldn't even see." Chuck didn't respond right away. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands again. Then he looked out at the endless line where the desert met the sky. "Learning," Chuck said slowly, "has everything to do with listening, humility. Machines don't lie. They always give you a warning, but not everyone has the patience to understand them, or the humility to listen to someone who does." Carson stood in silence, absorbing the words. Eventually, he stepped forward and extended his hand again, not as a formality this time, but as a man offering respect. Chuck took it. They stood like that for a moment. Two generations of engineers, two very different paths, bound by one simple truth. What's broken doesn't stay broken when someone cares enough to listen. Carson returned to his SUV and drove away, the dust trailing behind him like a ribbon unraveling in the wind. Chuck remained standing still, surrounded by tools, tractors, and silence. But in that silence lived a kind of peace, a quiet confirmation that real value doesn't disappear with age, obscurity, or time. It simply waits to be seen again by those who finally learn to look. Chuck stayed under that wide desert sky long after the SUV disappeared from sight. He didn't move quickly, didn't reach for another tool right away. There was something about the quiet that morning that felt different, heavier and lighter all at once, a quiet without weight, not the silence of loneliness, which he had known so well over the years, but the silence that comes after a long, overdue truth has been spoken. Chuck wasn't a man who chased praise, but even he couldn't deny the way that small moment, Carson's hand, his words, his humility, had stirred something in him, maybe not pride, but something close, maybe peace. Back inside his shed later that night, Chuck sat at his little workbench, a cracked mug of black coffee warming his hands. The envelope from General Kurtz was still in the pocket of his jacket, untouched. He hadn't opened it, probably wouldn't for a while. It wasn't that he didn't need the money. He did. His legs still ached in the evenings, and the medical bills had a way of slipping through cracks he thought he'd already patched. But opening that envelope felt like admitting the moment had passed, like putting a lid on it. Right now, he preferred to let it sit there, unopened and full of meaning, like a promise that came too late but still mattered. He reached for an old photograph pinned to the wall above his desk. It was faded, curling at the edges. A snapshot taken decades ago. A much younger Chuck, standing next to a military jeep, grease on his shirt, a shy smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. One of the only pictures of him in uniform. No ceremony, no medals, just a captured moment of purpose. He held it a little longer that night, his thumb brushing over the edge as if touching the past might bring it closer. The next few days were quiet again, just how Chuck liked them. He returned to his usual circuit, farms on the west side of town, a construction site near a dry creek bed where a backhoe kept stalling. The workers there were younger, full of caffeine and jokes and music that thumped through cheap speakers. Chuck didn't mind. He stayed on the edge of things, just close enough to hear what needed fixing, just far enough to avoid the buzz of conversation. He was used to being outside the circle, not because he wasn't welcome, but because he no longer needed to be inside it. But word travels fast in small circles, and within a week, the story had begun to shift. A farmer asked him if it was true. Had he really fixed one of the Army's new super tanks? Chuck didn't answer, just kept working. Another contractor chuckled as he handed Chuck a wrench. Didn't know we had a war hero living behind the old repair shop. Chuck didn't correct him, didn't say he wasn't a hero, didn't say he wasn't living, just accepted the tool and got back under the machine. The thing about legacy is, it doesn't always return with trumpets and applause. Sometimes it sneaks in through the back door, wearing a borrowed name and writing on someone else's voice. Chuck had learned long ago that the truth of a man's worth wasn't in plaques or paychecks. It was in whether the broken things stopped breaking when he was around, whether the work stayed fixed, whether the job meant something. One afternoon, as he was finishing a repair job on a grain combine just outside town, he heard another car coming up the dirt road. Not the usual beat-up trucks or dusty pickups. This one was newer, darker, with tinted windows and quiet tires. Chuck stood slowly, wiping his hands, watching as the vehicle approached. When the door opened, it wasn't Carson or a military official. It was a young woman in civilian clothes, carrying a clipboard and a polite smile. "Mr. Renner," she asked. Chuck nodded. "I'm here on behalf of the Army's Veterans Outreach Division," she said. "We'd like to talk to you. No pressure, just a conversation." Chuck didn't move. "About what?" "Your service, your experience, your voice," she said. "There's a new program. We're documenting the stories of veterans with unique contributions. Quiet heroes, they call them." He almost laughed at that, quiet heroes, as if that label could undo the decades of silence that came after his injury. But she didn't seem like someone with an agenda. She looked young enough to still believe in the power of stories, and old enough to understand their cost. "I'm not really the storytelling type," he said. "I get that," she replied, "but sometimes stories don't belong to us alone. Sometimes they belong to the ones who come after." That gave Chuck pause. He thought about the engineers in that hangar, about the way Carson had looked at him, not just with respect, but with recognition. That something unteachable had passed between them. Maybe she was right. Maybe the story wasn't just his anymore. He nodded toward the bench. "You want coffee?" She smiled. "Sure." They talked for hours. About his early years, the orphanage, the engines he rebuilt before he could shave, about the Army, about 1982. He didn't dramatize it, just told it like it was. She listened, took notes, didn't interrupt. He told her how machines speak in vibrations and resistance, how silence often means more than noise, how a man's value can outlast his credentials if someone's paying attention. When she finally left, she shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Renner, for everything." After she was gone, Chuck sat a while longer on the bench. That envelope was still in his jacket pocket, still unopened, but something inside him had already shifted. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like he was holding onto the past. He felt like he was handing it off. A week later, a letter arrived. It wasn't official military correspondence. No seals or medals inside. Just a plain envelope with a typed return address from a technical school in New Mexico. One of their instructors had heard about Chuck from the Army's outreach story, had shared it with students. They wanted to know if he'd consider visiting. Not to teach, just to talk, to show them the stethoscope he'd used, to tell them what it felt like to listen instead of diagnose. Chuck stared at the letter for a long time, then folded it carefully and set it next to the envelope from General Kurtz. He didn't say yes, not right away, but he didn't throw it out either. That night, he stepped outside and sat under the stars behind his shed. The desert sky above him was wide, limitless, dark with just the right amount of glow. He leaned back in the old lawn chair, the one with one leg shorter than the others. The wind rustled the dry brush around him, and for the first time in a long time, Chuck didn't feel like he was waiting for something to be fixed. He felt, still, like something had already been set right, deep inside the parts of himself he hadn't touched in years. In the far off hangars and armored walls of Fort Wuka, the tank Chuck had repaired continued its trial runs without failure. The engineers stopped questioning the cause of its previous issue. They just updated the specs and listed a new standard for thermal vibration testing in hybrid mounts. No one remembered to credit the change to Chuck. And that was fine, because Chuck knew the tank was running, the machine was whole, and so, in many ways, was he. Weeks passed, and the buzz that followed Chuck's return to Fort Wuka slowly began to fade from military circles. The engineers moved on to new prototypes, new problems. The story of the old guy with the limp became an anecdote shared quietly over coffee, more myth than memory to some. But for Chuck, the world had not dramatically changed, and that, oddly enough, was a relief. He still woke early, still packed his thermos of black coffee, still drove his groaning pickup across the sun-baked roads of Arizona. The old routines held him steady, but beneath the surface, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't just the recognition or the envelope or the quiet apology that had meant something. It was the feeling that, for the first time in years, his work had echoed beyond the job, that it had been seen. One morning, as Chuck was working on a generator at a feed processing plant, a teenage boy from the facility came over, awkward but curious. He hovered, watching Chuck's movements closely, fidgeting with a small notepad. After a few minutes, he asked, "How do you know what to check first?" Chuck glanced at him, then back at the engine. "You listen." The boy laughed softly, assuming it was a joke. "No, really." Chuck didn't laugh. Machines talk, not like people do, but they all have a rhythm. You get to know it. You know where the rhythm breaks. That's where the problem lies." The boy scribbled something down. Chuck didn't ask what. He didn't need to. Just the fact that the boy asked, that someone young and why died still saw mechanics as something mysterious and worth learning, that was enough to carry him through the rest of the day. Maybe even longer. That same week, he finally opened the envelope from General Kurtz, not because he suddenly wanted the money or validation, but because it was time. Inside was a check substantial, more than he expected. Enough to patch his roof, fix the heater that wheezed all winter, maybe even trade in the old pickup for something that didn't need prayers before starting. But there was also something else. A handwritten note on official letterhead. "Sergeant Renner, thank you for answering the call again. You were never forgotten by those who mattered. I regret that it took us so long to show it. Respectfully, Major General Anthony Kurtz." Chuck folded the letter and placed it in a wooden box under his bed, a box that once held his dog tags, a pocket knife, and the last picture he had of his unit. It had been empty for years, but now, not anymore. Time moved the way it always does, and fairly fast when moments are finally good, painfully slow during the in-betweens. But Chuck settled back into his rhythm. He fixed things, tractors, loaders, water pumps. He lived in a world of function, and that was where he was happiest. But every so often, someone new would show up. A college kid interning at a nearby engineering company. A military technician from the base who'd heard about the old timer with the stethoscope. They'd drive out of their way just to find him, not for help necessarily, but for advice, for his ear, for the way he listened. He never charged them. He rarely said much. He'd just nod, let them ramble about their mechanical mysteries, and if they stayed long enough, he'd eventually say something like, "Try isolating the housing at half heat. Bet you'll hear it then." And he was almost always right. It was never about being right, though. It was about making sure someone knew how to be right next time. One Saturday evening, Chuck was invited to a small veterans gathering in town. He almost didn't go. Crowds weren't his thing, but a woman named Lindis, one who ran the local parts store and had known him for 20 years, dropped by and left a flyer on his bench with a note scribbled on the back. "You don't have to say anything, just show up, that's enough." So he did. He wore the one collared shirt that still had all its buttons and the boots that hurt a little less than the others. The gathering was small, set in a rec hall with folding chairs and too much chili. There were old stories being told, mostly exaggerated, most of them true in their own strange way. When Chuck arrived, he nodded politely, stood along the back wall, hands in his pockets. A few people waved. Some didn't recognize him, others did and made their way over slowly. One man, a retired colonel with a cane and a voice like gravel, pointed at Chuck and said, "You the guy from the Fort Wuka job?" Chuck nodded once. The colonel chuckled, "Damn right you are. I heard they were calling in ghosts to fix that mess." Chuck smirked. Wasn't much of a haunting. They laughed, not at him, with him, and it felt strange. This easy laughter, this acceptance without pretense. For a moment, Chuck didn't feel like an outsider standing in the shadows. He felt like part of the story again. By the end of the night, a few of the younger vets asked if he'd come speak at the local tech school. Chuck hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his thing, never had been. But something about the way they asked, hopeful, without pressure, made it harder to say no. "Maybe," he said, "we'll see." And he meant it. The next day, he went back to work on a baler that kept throwing timing belts. But something about the world felt just a bit different, not brighter, not easier, but warmer, like he was no longer living just at the edge of things. Like maybe, finally, the world was turning back toward him, slowly, carefully, ready to hear what he'd known all along. He still lived in that little shed behind the repair shop, still brewed strong coffee in the mornings and drank it out of the same mug he'd had for over a decade. But now there were books on the shelf, manuals, yes, but also a few donated by those young interns and students he'd helped. For the guy who taught me how to hear an engine, one inscription read, "You don't know me, but your story changed how I see my work. Read another." Chuck didn't read them all, but he kept them, because even a quiet life leaves a trail, one that winds through barns, hangars, military bases, and open roads. And if you follow that trail, you eventually find a man with a limp and a gift and a story that didn't end when the army sent him home. It just paused until the world was ready to listen, and now, finally, it was. The seasons changed slowly in the Arizona desert. There wasn't much fanfare, just a gradual shift in the color of the light and the way the wind moved across the land. Chuck moved with it, quietly, steadily, like a man who no longer needed to race ahead of time or run from it. He'd learned how to exist in the rhythm of machines and silence, but now he was learning something else too, how to exist in the rhythm of people again. He ended up speaking at the tech school after all, not because he had something to prove, but because the request kept coming, gentle, persistent, like a knock that doesn't want to be rude but refuses to go unanswered. He didn't prepare a speech. He just brought the tools he used, the mechanical stethoscope, a handful of notes scribbled on old envelopes and stories. That was enough. He stood in front of a classroom full of students with fresh notebooks and impatient energy, and he told them how things really break and how to really listen. He told them how failure doesn't always announce itself with alarms and warning lights, but sometimes with a whisper, with a shift in vibration, with the faintest change in resistance. They listened to every word, and when they asked questions, he didn't lecture. He told more stories, some funny, some painful, all real. Afterward, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19 came up and said, "I didn't know fixing machines could sound like poetry." Chuck smiled at that. Not a big smile, just a crease at the edge of his mouth, the kind that takes years to earn. He didn't become famous. There were no medals pinned to his chest, no viral stories online, no honorary degrees mailed to his shed. But his world expanded anyway, slowly, thoughtfully. People began reaching out, not with praise, but with questions, real questions, about problems they couldn't solve, engines they couldn't diagnose, careers they weren't sure how to begin. Chuck didn't have all the answers, but what he did have was rare. the ability to look at something broken and see not just the flaw, but the reason it broke, and how to fix it without making a big show of fixing it. One evening, he received a small package in the mail. It was from Fort Wuka. Inside was a plaque. No ceremony, no speech, just a few words etched in simple lettering, with deepest respect and gratitude, to the man who still listens when others stop trying to hear. Chuck didn't mount it on a wall. That wasn't his style. He placed it on the shelf above his workbench, next to the coffee mug, the old photo of his unit, and a small, folded flag that had been given to him years ago, back when his career had ended with silence, not applause. The shelf had become something like a timeline now, not a museum, not a shrine, just pieces of a life that had meant something. Even when it seemed like no one noticed, he still drove his pickup, still limp, still got up early and made coffee in the same battered kettle. But now, the silence around him was different. It wasn't hollow. It was filled with the weight of moments he hadn't known he was waiting for. The handshake from a general, the apology from a man who thought he knew everything, the student who saw poetry in pistons, the long, awaited return of purpose. There were still bad days. His leg still acted up in the cold. Some mornings he'd wake with the sharp reminder that time had passed, that youth had left its marks and then kept walking. But even then, there was something to hold on to, a call, a job, a knock at the shed door. Some machine, somewhere, needed him again. And that's what mattered. Not titles, not praise, just the work. The quiet promise that if you listen long enough, every broken thing eventually reveals the truth of why it failed. And if you're lucky and patient and humble enough to hear it, you'll know how to make it whole again. Chuck Rainer didn't fix everything, but what he touched with care. What he heard, he truly heard. And in the end, that was his legacy. Not the years in the army, not the scars or the setbacks, but the simple, unwavering truth that what is quiet is not worthless, that what is unseen is not gone, and that sometimes the world circles back to the people it once overlooked, because it finally realizes they were the ones holding it together all along. And so he remained between two worlds with his tools, his silence, and the quiet knowledge that he had never truly been forgotten. He had simply been waiting for the world to remember how to listen.